Welcome to another episode of Creative Life with Julia Esch. Hi, I'm Julia. I'm an abstract artist and photographer, and on this podcast, I encourage you to live a life full of creativity and passion. Today, I want to talk about finding your spark again. And I'm not talking about just a creative spark here. I do think that the spark that you tap into creatively is the same as the one that we perceive as some sort of guiding constellation or inner light that we stick to while we are on our journey throughout life. So I do think that it's actually the same place, but I just think that the impact shows up in different areas of our lives or our personalities. And I want to talk about this because I personally have benefited a lot from people opening up about their journey and sharing their experience. And on one hand, it gave me inspiration for different things to try, and some of them proved to be helpful to me or initiated a trail of thought or habits or activities that turned out to be helpful down the road. And the second thing being, it just made me feel comfortable in that moment when I saw that somebody else was dealing with something similar as me. It created a feeling of comfort, of not being alone in this. So I hope to create something similar for somebody who might stumble upon this. And maybe this video and my story will give you both inspiration and maybe comfort. So I would like to start with how it felt to me when I would say I lost my spark. And straight away, I would like to point out that I don't think that it's something we really lose. I do think that we get disconnected from it and we lose sight of it. And I think the visual image and the association and story is going to be individual for everyone. It's shaped by your memories, your fantasy, your experiences. But for me, for instance, it's some sort of lighthouse or guiding constellation that I look up to when I either ask myself if something that I feel like I need to do or that I'm offered, if that really aligns with me and if that is authentic. I feel like I go to that place and I look at that. Sometimes when I do have the feeling that I don't know what my course is supposed to be at this moment. And sometimes I do feel like I don't know what the course is. That would be that spark or that lighthouse would be what I would look at to get at least a remote and brief and rough answer to that question. Or at least to feel like I do have at least some sort of orientation in that moment. And at the same time, I do think that it is kind of a flame within, a driving force that is fueling my engine and kind of eternally 24/7 keeping me on the move and pushing me further and further into life. And it's kind of the source of my energy to do things, to feel things. Yeah, so how did I even get there? So there was a variety of factors playing into this. But I do think that we can put a starting point around 2012, where I moved countries once again in my life. I moved from Latvia to Germany. And I was in a quite strange position because German is my native tongue, but I haven't grown up in Germany. So I was still a kid and very young when we had to leave. it was a strange time. It was a strange time because I do understand that I was still in a very fortunate position because of my language. At the same time, it still was a complete change of environment for me. It was a complete 180 on my way of life as well. And at the same time, I also started studying during that time. So it was a lot of things coming together. And in hindsight, I do realize that all of that was taking up so much of my life and so much of me that it seems completely logical that there was no place left for any creativity. But the thing is that I don't think that spark means necessarily just creativity. At some point, I just noticed that I was lacking that zest for life and that curiosity and somewhat daring and bold and open-minded and adventurous attitude had shifted in me so drastically, and that I felt like my entire identity had molten into something completely different. And at the same time, I noticed how all my focus, all my energy was poured into things that were deemed as logical and correct to do, especially when you have just moved to a new country. Even if I knew the language, but still, it was a new country. Switching all sorts of things in life around, it seems quite logical to pour all your energy in there, right? But at the same time, what I completely missed at that point is that I was neglecting some parts of myself and some parts of my headspace that have been very, very vital for me to be able to even get that far and to get to that point. And that all these mechanisms and all these things that I was doing, they were actually part of my mental support system, I would say. The key factor that I feel was making that flame in me die out was that I was putting my focus and my eyes not on the horizon or that lighthouse or that guiding constellation that was mine. I was putting it in all sorts of places that I felt were correct from a rational point of view, were mirrored to me from the outside as the correct choices. At the same time, something in me still, even though I was so disconnected with, let's say, that spark, something in me still kept pushing and still kept resisting every time I would be on the verge of choosing the most boring and most unauthentic thing possible for me. There would still be a little piece of rebellion left in me, apparently, and I would do something to derail it and to put it into a different direction. The issue with that is, though, that when you aren't consciously following any of this, when you aren't aware of this, it all increasingly starts feeling like things are just slipping out of your control. Like you are like things are completely slipping out of your grip. And I believe to many people this would be a very destabilizing and quite anxiety inducing experience, and it was no different for me. And back then, because I was very disconnected with my creative inner space, with my identity in a way, I felt like I felt like first I didn't have a direction where I could turn that would seem any better. It felt really like that window of opportunities that I could look at. It was very small and it was getting increasingly smaller. And it's a cycle. Once you don't have that that spark, that light that you can focus yourself on, and that kind of anchors you and makes you bounce back on the track that you initially were heading to. Once you disconnect from that, I feel there is such a big void that can be filled with all sorts of things that at that moment seem important to the part of you that is very attached to security. You become very prone to other people's opinions. You become very prone to other people's input on what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And it made me detach very, very much from all visual art that I ever had done. So I increasingly was just doing less and less. And at some point, the maximum I would do was doodling in notebooks or on a piece of paper sometimes, and not even creating anything remotely inspired or with a concept or with an idea or with a story, or and it all felt very blunt. It felt more like coping and de-stressing, but without any meaning behind it. And that was something that I at some point I felt really strange about that, because I think that was the moment when I realized something had changed and I had lost connection to a part of myself that I had considered so vital, so important, so key to who I am. And another thing that I noticed at some point in the previous episode, I talked about how my visual engine kind of works, how I visualize things, and how music does play a big role in that as well. And at some point, I noticed that that had gone too. It had gone. And that was the moment when I would sometimes still get like some imagery, maybe some. I would get an emotional response definitely to music, but the visual response was completely gone. And that was, I think, the point where I started looking for content somewhat similar to what I'm producing here right now. I was wondering if other creatives have gone through something similar too. And that was when I kind of started asking myself, all right, this thing is off, but that's actually the least of my issues right now, because a lot of other things were also increasingly getting worse for me at that point. So I felt like I was making inauthentic choices, and at the same time, a part of me was very unsatisfied and very uncomfortable with that, and very angry with that, and was on those rare occasions where there would be an opportunity to put all of that out, I would do so. And I would do so with quite extreme things. I would also pour that out on close people around me as well sometimes. So it was a very, very strange experience. And the thing is, when you aren't aware of these things happening, and now that I have built that infrastructure where I can kind of, you know, just go a few steps higher and look at the big picture, and I recognize a pattern and I can trace it and I can do something. I wasn't at that point back then. And that again also made it very difficult for me to recognize that I actually was steering further and further away from that spark within, from that source, from that life energy that was actually driving me and taking me places, and actually one of my biggest resources to this day. It's one of my biggest resources. It's that for everyone, because that is where your intrinsic motivation comes from. That's where the desire to do things, to create things, to change things, and to impact things comes from. And that is what you also tap into, or at least from my perspective, I tap into that source when things also sometimes just don't work out with the first try or the second or the third try. And when there are things where you need to sit through for weeks, months, sometimes years, to me, this is the place where I go to kind of recharge and to get my little bit of energy and to get my little bit of motivation and to get my little bit of hope and will to carry on. And back then, because I was lacking that structure to take a look at all of this in connection to each other, I was completely blind to that pattern. I was completely blind to that pattern and to that process, that I was further and further drifting away with every choice that I was making without consulting, without having the connection to that part of me. I was creating more and more of an environment that wasn't making things better for sure. And I mean, now we have dived quite deeply into the portion of how it felt and how it happened that I ended up at that place where I had lost my spark. I wasn't making any art. I was finding less and less joy in things that I used to love and that used to really recharge me and ignite something in me. It all had kind of faded. And then actually in the next chapter, I'd say things partially needed to get worse before they got better. But at the same time, from that urge to let all of that pent up anger, sadness, hurt, all of that, to let that out somewhere, I turned to music. And I also turned there because that was the social environment where I felt like I could still connect in a way that was more authentic than any other space that I had in my life at that time. And talking from today's perspective, all of that sounds very conscious and very planned and very thought through. It was anything than that. It was everything beyond that. It was a quite impulsive idea and decision at some point that I was starting looking for a band, because up to that point I had increasingly written lyrics, written my own songs, because I had completely lost touch with the visual part, but I still had that emotional response to music, even though I was mostly feeling not so much inspired, but I was just feeling a bunch of very intense emotions that needed to go somewhere. So, and that is how I actually ended up finding my first band. Then after a quite short period of time, we did have some gigs together, but then after a quite short period, I joined another band where I stayed for a longer time. And I think through music, what happened is that I was able to access my creative self a little bit more again. And I also was starting to create a little bit more visual things again as well. But it came very much from a place of coping and venting and purging rather than creating. And I want to tap a little bit into what I mean by this. When you create just for the sake of letting things out, that is still very valuable, but it is different. It is different, and it also feeds a different process in you and in your headspace. That's my personal take and my personal experience and opinion. So to me back then it felt like, if I did something creative, it was very much to vent, to release, to allow things to come out after they've been either suppressed for a long time or I couldn't express them in a different way. So I think I just now enter a phase where, or I recently, in the recent years, have entered a phase where I am able to have a different connection to music as well. Because back then it was very much from a place of very raw emotion, and that was my relationship with any creative output that I had at that time. And I think I reached a point then when my life was kind of functionally going more or less well, but again, I kind of felt everything rubbing against something inside of me because I felt really out of place at that work environment I was in back then. Even though I loved the profession and I was good at what I did at the same time, depending on the environment I was put into and the human circle I was put into, I was increasingly feeling very misplaced. And again, back then I had this strategy of functionality and security goes above all, and I definitely was doing a lot to just distract myself and numb a lot of the feelings and the thoughts that I would have. So, what I do think the game changer at some point was that my functionality, time and time again, had decreased and crumbled away through all the years where I pushed through without consulting that inner compass. I only stopped living in that pattern actually when I actually started therapy. So, this is probably the most important chapter in this episode, I'd say, because that was the key for me to understand how I'm wired and who I am. What therapy gave me foremost was somebody who nudged me just a little bit into all the right questions, into all the right directions, all those things that I started asking myself, and then I was trying to sit with the discomfort that came with some of the answers. Because the reality is that as much as we try to bend ourselves into structures and places that seem to be promising, they seem to be good, they seem to be right from a rational perspective or from the point of view of someone you admire or respect or that means to you a lot. But they are a different person. They have different needs. They have a different biography. They have a different mental structure. They have different strengths and different weaknesses than you do. So to me, it meant layer by layer, finally finding out who actually is that person behind that spark, behind that fire within. Who is that entity? Who is that personality? Who is that something that stands behind it? And for me, it also meant recognizing that many parts that had to some extent been hard to deal with, hard to listen to, hard to sit with, that many of them actually have an agenda that aligns very much with what I want to pursue, where I want to go, who I want to be, where I want to be, who I want to surround myself with, in what environment I want to live and I want to spend my lifetime. And while talking about this, of course, I do keep in mind that really there's nothing that is ever guaranteed to you. There's also no guarantee that either one of us will always have the ability to choose where we live and how we live. Things are very often out of our control. But it's very helpful to know who you actually are, who you are when you strip away all the expectations your environment has for you, all the expectations you think people close to you and dear to you. Because it's again a projection of what they imagine, a projection of what they need, of where they see themselves as well. And understanding that we all look at things from a lens that is very much shaped the way we are shaped. I think once I looked through that mechanism and understood that, I think that took away a lot of fear that I had. And at some point, I got really comfortable with the idea that I have done the things and been the human that I feel is sitting somewhere in there. I would rather do that than try to continuously bend myself into places and into circles and activities that make sense to everyone else, but they don't make sense to me. I then even consciously didn't fully understand, I think, that what I needed was a complete turnaround in terms of career and my work environment and in the place where I am productive. But intuitively, of course, I did feel that, and things played out in a way that I fell out of my job back then for some time, for a few months. And during that time, I actually wasn't in a very good place. But what happened is I started playing a video game that became actually one of my all-time favorite games, and it's Bloodborne. So I was spending entire days and nights in that game. Those of you who have played it will know that the fights in there and the boss fights are not for the faint-hearted, not for the weak. So I did get actually some pain in my thumbs and my hands because I was playing that on the console with a controller. And what I loved about this game was everything. And the thing is, even though I was in such an unproductive and such a really heavy and sad place, actually, I was so blown away. I got sucked into that world so deeply. And of course, that wasn't necessarily a good thing from the point of view of mental and physical health at that moment. But what it did, it kind of kickstarted my visual engine. What I noticed, I was finally seeing things again. I was listening to music and I was seeing sceneries, partially from that game, but then new things emerging in my head. I was completely amazed and in love with all the creatures, with all the details in that world, with the entire aesthetic. I was starting to get costume ideas. I was starting to get interested in cosplaying, and I actually still have that on my list. I want to recreate the huge hammer that the hunter in Bloodborne carries. But anyways, I started looking into crafty things again. I just started exploring visual things again. I was getting excited about them again. And it seemed like that time where I was once again sitting there and contemplating what I had done wrong, what had gone wrong, why am I again at this place? Even though I had tried my best, why am I again at a place where everybody's dissatisfied and things haven't worked out? Like, what is this? At the same time, I finally had space in my head again for all those things that excited me. And it was about the same time that I picked up therapy again. And this time it was a little bit more focused on finding out what actually is preventing me from doing the things that I want to do and that would satisfy me on a different level and that I really feel like would be the thing that I want to do. If I had the choice, that's what I would do. And then for, I believe, around 2 to 3 years, I was working with a licensed therapist, and during that time, I managed to turn around my career. I switched away from working in the newsrooms previously for years. I turned to the marketing side, as quite a few people do in that sector of work. But yeah, I turned into that, and I found a company where, as well, on a human level, I connected with people really, really well. Overall, things turned out way better than I would have ever expected, because at that time I finally gave myself permission to listen to that spark and that guiding light. I finally gave myself permission to take that seriously, to not put rational reasoning, that especially when that is directed and dictated a lot by the outside environment and outside input. I stopped labeling that more important than what my compass is saying. And I think that is the reason why I'm so passionate about talking about this as well. And I'm sure that there must be somewhere at least a few people who have had the same struggle or are actually amidst the same struggle right now. And I don't think it is something that you figure out in a day or in a week or in a month. I don't think that connecting to that spark again, or connecting to that spark in the first place, happens quickly. But I do think that that is an investment worthwhile. For me, it meant investing my effort, my time, a part of my mental health, a part of my physical health, in the sense of first having a few very bumpy years with these things, and then finally investing into professional support. And I think that is the combination that kind of did the trick for me. Not saying that, wow, I figured it all out, but what I can say is I feel very, very connected to that source that I am talking about. I feel very connected to that part of me that I feel is making choices that are authentic. And that part, to be honest, isn't as ego driven and as hard and close to negotiation as I thought in my earlier years. Once you start listening to that part, I feel it actually becomes quite open to negotiation and quite open to the idea of maybe compromising in a few points. but making sure that we aren't compromising ourselves too much into it, and that we aren't stripping away parts that are actually essential to the system and that are not up for compromise. And I believe that is what really long term fueled that connection to the spark, or is still fueling that connection to the spark. And yeah, in the end, it actually led to me renting my art studio in 2019. That is a story of its own, because I did that while I was still figuring things out in terms of what do I exactly want to do, what direction in art I want to go to. So I rented this space and I started doing all these things without a firm direction or a straight path where I would go. But what I knew and the decision that I made was I want to build my own creative world. I want to build my own workspace. I want to produce my own work, and I don't want to limit myself anymore. And yeah, so I guess that is the very chaotic way how to find your spark again. I think it's with the help of first bumping into a few walls and having a few bumpy years and figuring out that probably you should take a look at the system that you're trying to function within and to deal with, and that you need to live with. And then figuring out what would make that system satisfied, what would make you satisfied, and what would supply you with excitement, more or less long term. So this episode turned out to be a quite personal one, but I mean, I'm sure that many of you will resonate with parts of the story at least. So, and what I want to do now is to close this episode with a tarot card. So let's shuffle and see what message we've got in store today. Whoop! So, we've got the moon here. The moon is a very interesting card, and one that fits today's episode quite well, I think. The moon talks a lot about things that are hidden from us, but also about intuition. If you aren't a fan, by the way, of these type of things, try to see it as a psychological exercise maybe, or as a positive affirmation to take with you. But yeah, the moon, in terms of both the tarot but also astrology, it relates to the more emotional side of things and kind of the soul side of us. So everything that is very emotions driven, very much related to emotional processing of something. And what this card does, it invites to connect with that place and also to find trust even in a situation where things are uncertain and where things are disguised from you. And it doesn't mean that they are not there. So remember what I said about that guiding light or that spark never being gone, but not seeing it. So this card, I feel, ties into that very, very well. So I do think that even though sometimes the cause for things might not be clear, or very often the outcome or the cause of something might not be clear, But I do think that we can and should rely on our personal experience, on what we feel is the path that we want to go down. Because regardless of the outcome, we are the ones who are responsible for carrying ourselves to the best place possible. The truth is, nobody else is going to do that for us. But it's also the beauty in it, right? Because nobody else gets to tell us how we are supposed to walk this road and to go through this journey. And just because somebody else can't see the vision that you're pursuing doesn't mean that it isn't there and that it isn't worth pursuing. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit the subscribe button. I release new episodes every 2 weeks. You can also follow me on Instagram and look at all of my art in full beauty there. Thank you for being here, and I hope to see you again in another episode.